The reports arriving at Allied headquarters in early 1945 carried a pattern few had anticipated. Columns of figures, unit markers, and distance estimates began revealing something unusual. Armored formations were advancing faster than operational planners had projected only days earlier. What had been calculated as a methodical push across contested territory was becoming a rapid surge deep into enemy space. After action summaries documented gains that exceeded planned timetables. Distances, originally estimated to require weeks of coordinated movement, were being covered in days. In some sectors, spearhead elements reported positions far ahead of scheduled objectives. Reconnaissance units struggled to update maps quickly enough to reflect the changing front. The tempo was no longer incremental. It was accelerating. Armored spearheads, exploiting gaps in weakened defenses, bypassed resistance instead of pausing to eliminate it. Infantry units followed two secure flanks and neutralized isolated pockets. Artillery displacement became routine, leapfrogging forward to maintain firing support without breaking momentum. The operational design had anticipated progress. It had not fully anticipated this scale of velocity. Logistics columns faced increasing strained. Fuel convoys were forced to travel longer distances over roads not fully cleared of debris. Maintenance crews worked continuously to keep vehicles operational under sustained movement. Supply officers recalculated distribution priorities almost daily as formations advanced beyond originally forecast supply radii. Communication networks were stretched. Signal units had to extend lines repeatedly. Field headquarters relocated forward more frequently than planned. In some cases, command elements found themselves coordinating operations from positions that, only days before, had been considered deep rear areas. Operational planners revised projections repeatedly. Each new estimate of enemy resistance proved outdated within hours. Defensive lines expected to slow progress for days elapsed sooner. Road junctions marked as future objectives were captured ahead of schedule. Planning maps were amended again and again, arrows extending farther east. With each update, the speed itself became a strategic factor. Rapid movement denied the enemy time to reorganize. Defensive cohesion weakened when units were forced to respond. Two threats appearing sooner than anticipated. The psychological effect mirrored the physical one. Uncertainty spread when projections failed to match reality. At higher headquarters, the implications became clear. The tempo of advance was reshaping assumptions about the campaign's duration. Operations initially framed within cautious timelines were now unfolding under compressed horizons. Commanders who had prepared for deliberate progression began preparing for exploitation. Instead, momentum required maintenance. Fuel, maintenance, coordination age had to match the pace set by forward units. A slowdown caused by supply disruption could reverse the advantage. Sustained acceleration required constant adaptation. The battlefield was no longer moving according to pre-war planning models. It was moving according to opportunity. As distance markers on situation maps shifted faster than expected, headquarters faced a reassessment not of ambition, but of expectation. What had once seemed aggressive now appeared conservative. What had been considered optimistic was becoming routine. The tempo forced command to reconsider its own assumptions. Speed was no longer a variable within the plan. It was defining the plan itself. As the advance accelerated, a deliberate choice began shaping the battlefield. Not every enemy position would be attacked. Instead of reducing each defensive strongpoint through direct assault, armored formations began bypassing resistance whenever possible. If a fortified village artillery nest or entrenched infantry pocket did not directly block the axis of advance, it was marked, reported, and left for follow-on units to contain. Speed became the priority. Entire enemy defensive positions were encircled or isolated without prolonged engagement. Strongpoints that had been constructed to delay for days found themselves strategically irrelevant within hours. Supply routes behind them were surveyed. Communication with higher command was disrupted. Their tactical integrity remained, but their operational purpose dissolved. This method was not accidental. It reflected a growing confidence that momentum itself could substitute for complete battlefield clearance. Rather than grind forward in measured steps, spearhead units drove deeper, trusting that isolated resistance would collapse once cut off from reinforcement and resupply. But the approach carried risk. Some commanders warned that exposed flanks could invite counterattack. Bypassed units, though isolated, still possessed weapons, artillery, and the ability to disrupt real logistics. A determined breakout attempt against vulnerable supply columns could slow the advance significantly. Maps began to show irregular shapes instead of clean front lines. Pockets of resistance dotted rear areas. Convoys were rerouted to avoid contested zones. Infantry divisions assigned to consolidation found themselves tasked with securing territory that armored units had already passed through at high speed. The debate intensified. Inside headquarters, one argument emphasized sustainability. Secure the ground, eliminate threats systematically, preserve cohesion, and prevent surprises. A rapid advance without secure flanks risked overextension, particularly if enemy reserves regrouped unexpectedly. The opposing view focused on exploitation. Momentum, once achieved, was difficult to replicate if lost. Slowing down to eliminate every pocket would surrender initiative. Each delay granted the enemy time to reorganize, rebuild defensive lines, and reposition artillery. Speed disoriented the defender. Hesitation restored balance. Reports from the field fueled both sides of the discussion. In some sectors, bypassed units surrendered once isolated. In others, they mounted localized resistance, ambushing supply vehicles, or launching limited counterthrusts. The overall impact remained manageable, but the possibility of disruption lingered. Operational planners faced a fundamental question. Was security achieved through control of every mile, or through relentless forward pressure that prevented coordinated response? For the moment, exploitation prevailed. Armored spearheads continued driving forward, selecting routes based on opportunity rather than complete clearance. Artillery displacement focused on supporting forward movement rather than rear stabilization. Air support targeted retreating concentrations ahead instead of entrenched pockets behind. The battlefield transformed. Instead of a single continuous line, the front became a moving zone of action, fluid, irregular, constantly shifting. Strong points left behind were reduced in significance not because they lacked firepower, but because they lacked strategic position. Momentum imposed its own logic. The enemy's strength lay in prepared positions. The attacker's advantage lay in speed. As long as the advance continued, bypassed resistance remained isolated, problems rather than decisive obstacles. But everyone understood that the strategy depended on sustained tempo. If movement slowed, those isolated pockets could regain relevance. The debate over sustainability versus exploitation did not end. It intensified with each mile gained, because the faster the advance moved, the greater the question became: could momentum itself serve as security, or would unsealed flanks eventually demand their price? Inside forward headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from surprise to calculation. The speed of the advance had created opportunity, but it had also created exposure. Staff officers began running projections late into the night. Fuel consumption charts were updated repeatedly as armored units reported higher than expected usage. Ammunition expenditure, particularly artillery shells and anti-tank rounds, exceeded original forecasts. What had been planned as a controlled push was now unfolding as sustained exploitation. Logistics struggled to keep pace. Supply convoys traveled longer routes over increasingly strained infrastructure. Bridges required reinforcement to carry heavy armor. Maintenance units worked continuously to repair vehicles worn down by constant movement. Every additional mile of advance lengthened the supply chain. Distance amplified vulnerability. Communications networks stretched across widening fronts. Signal units had to extend lines repeatedly, often under imperfect conditions. Radio traffic intensified as coordination grew more complex. In several sectors, command posts operated at the edge of reliable contact with spearhead elements. The farther forward the armored columns moved, the thinner the margin for error became. Staff assessments focused on a central concern: overextension. A sudden and concentrated counterattack against exposed spearheads could isolate forward units from their logistical base. Enemy forces, even if weakened, retained the ability to exploit gaps if properly coordinated. If supply routes were cut or disrupted, momentum could stall abruptly. Maps reflected the risk. Forward elements protruded deeply into contested territory. sometimes forming narrow salients supported by limited lateral connection to adjacent formations. Flanks were guarded, but not in the depth traditionally preferred for sustained advance. Cartson urged consolidation. Some officers recommended a temporary pause secure captured territory, eliminate bypassed resistance, reinforce supply corridors, and restore cohesion before pushing farther. A stabilized front, they argued, would protect gains already achieved. Others feared that pause equaled surrender of initiative. Enemy command, given time, could regroup and fortify new defensive lines. Fresh resistance might prove more costly than continued exploitation while confusion persisted. Speed remained the defining advantage. The debate was not theoretical. Fuel stocks had measurable limits. Artillery units required predictable resupply. Medical evacuation chains grew longer as distances increased. Each system depended on coordination across expanding operational depth. Operational planners faced a narrowing window to advance too quickly and risk isolation, consolidate too slowly and risk losing momentum. Reports of minor enemy counterthrusts heightened concern. Though limited in scale, they demonstrated that resistance remained capable of localized response. A larger, coordinated effort launched against a vulnerable axis could impose serious delay. Yet forward commanders reported continued success. Defensive cohesion ahead appeared fractured. Reconnaissance indicated limited capacity for organized counteroffensive action. The enemy seemed reactive rather than strategic, responding to thrusts rather than shaping the battle. Still, the fear persisted. Overextension had historically punished advancing armies. Supply lines were lifelines. Communications were command arteries. If either failed under pressure, tactical success could quickly become operational setback. The decision was not about courage. It was about endurance. Could the supply system sustain the pace? Could communications maintain coherence? Could exposed spearheads withstand sudden pressure? Caution argued for balance. Momentum argued for continuation. As armored units prepared to push even farther, headquarters understood that success now depended less on breaking resistance and more on managing the strain. Created by their own speed, the advance had outrun expectation. The question was whether it might outrun its own support at Supreme Headquarters. The situation maps were no longer static representations of a stable front. They were living documents, updated constantly as reports arrived from advancing formations. General Dwight D. Eisenhower chose to examine them personally. Markers representing armored divisions had shifted dramatically in a matter of days. Arcs drawn to illustrate projected advances were already outdated. New positions extended deeper into enemy territory than earlier briefings had anticipated. What had begun as controlled progression now appeared as sweeping movement across multiple sectors. Eisenhower traced the lines carefully. He followed the axis of Patton's advance from its point of origin through successive breakthroughs. He noted where strongpoints had been bypassed, where resistance had collapsed, and where logistical strain appeared most acute. The pattern was not chaotic. It reflected deliberate exploitation. The gains were undeniable. Distances covered exceeded projections. Defensive belts expected to delay for extended periods had fractured quickly. Reports from field commanders confirmed that enemy coordination was weakening under sustained pressure. Intercepts and reconnaissance suggested that opposing forces were reacting piecemeal rather than executing cohesive counter-strategy. Yet the risks were visible as well. Forward units protruded into contested zones. Supply corridors stretched thin. Communications required constant reinforcement. The tempo that produced success also amplified vulnerability. Any significant disruption could expose the very spearheads responsible for the breakthrough. Eisenhower considered both realities simultaneously. He understood that caution offered security. Consolidation would reduce exposure, secure flanks, and allow logistics to stabilize. But consolidation would also reduce pressure. It would grant the enemy time to regroup, reorganize, and restore defensive integrity. Speed, on the other hand, was producing measurable strategic effect. Enemy coherence was collapsing under the pace of movement. Defensive planning cycles were being compressed. Orders issued by opposing command often arrived too late to influence events on the ground. The psychological dimension of the campaign was shifting alongside the physical one. Momentum had become more than velocity. It was shaping decision cycles, disrupting coordination, and forcing reactive posture on the defender. Each mile gained without pause multiplied confusion behind enemy lines. Each delay avoided preserved that imbalance. Eisenhower recognized this dynamic clearly. The campaign had entered a phase where tempo itself functioned as a weapon. Slowing unnecessarily risked surrendering that advantage. The opportunity created by rapid advance might not return if lost. After reviewing the maps and accompanying reports, his assessment crystallized. The risks of overextension were real, but the strategic benefit of continued pressure was greater. He concluded that momentum must be preserved. Orders reflected that judgment. Exploitation would continue, supported by intensified logistical coordination and reinforced communications. Vulnerabilities would be managed, but not at the cost of halting forward movement. Hesitation would favor the defender. Speed favored the attacker in choosing momentum over pause. Eisenhower accepted calculated exposure in exchange for sustained disruption of enemy structure. The decision aligned operational tempo with strategic objective, denied the opponent the time required to rebuild coherence. The maps were updated. Again, the arcs extended forward, and the advance continued, not recklessly, but with deliberate commitment to the principle that, at this stage of the campaign, speed itself was decisive.